For centuries, we've treated Judas as a joke, the obvious villain in a story everyone already knows the ending to, the guy with the money bag, the textbook traitor. But have we ever stopped to consider him a real character, with real motivations, real fears, a man who held, for one instant, the power to change the course of all human history? Why did he betray the very man he'd followed for years? Why that specific moment and not another? And what if he wasn't so different from any of us, trying to force things to happen the way he thought was right? This is the story nobody tells properly. Let's try. Before any betrayal, there was just an ordinary man being called. Judas Iscariot appears in the lists of the 12 disciples almost always last, and almost always with the same note attached to his name, who also betrayed him, Matthew 10:4. The text hands you the ending before the story even begins, as if the narrator doesn't trust anyone to figure it out on their own. But if we set that spoiler aside for a moment and go back to the beginning, what's left is the portrait of a man chosen on purpose, alongside the other 11, by Jesus. He didn't stumble onto Judas by accident. He called him. Iscariot likely comes from Ish-Karioth, man of Karioth, a town in Judea. That alone says something. While most of the others came from Galilee, a simple region far from power, Judas may have been the only one in the group with roots closer to Jerusalem, to the temple, to money. And it's exactly money that clings to him with an uncomfortable frequency. John's Gospel says, plainly, that Judas was in charge of the group's common purse, and adds, not that he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. John 12:6. A small pattern, repeated, quiet. Discrete thefts, low-intensity wrong choices, that may have been laying the groundwork for a much bigger one. And this is where the question gets genuinely uncomfortable. Why would a man who walked alongside miracles, who saw the same blind eyes open and the same dead rise that the other 11 saw, decide to hand that same man over for a handful of silver? The most direct answer the Gospels offer is money. 30 coins, the price agreed upon in Matthew 26 verse 15, echoing directly an old prophecy from Zechariah about the price at which I was priced by them, Zechariah 11:12. But John adds a darker layer. Satan entered into him, John 13 verse 27, at the exact moment of the Last Supper, right after Jesus placed the piece of bread into his hands. The Gospels don't settle on a single explanation. Greed, yes, but also something bigger, something spiritual, working behind the greed. Like a second player moving pieces Judas may not have even known were in play. Yet perhaps the strangest moment in his entire story isn't the betrayal itself, it's what comes right after. Matthew records that when Judas saw Jesus condemned, he was seized by a remorse so intense that he tries to return the 30 coins to the chief priests, Matthew 27:3. They refuse. And, unable to undo what he'd done, he hangs himself. That doesn't quite fit a man who planned everything in cold blood, does it? Someone purely calculating wouldn't collapse like that afterward. It suggests something more complicated. Maybe he never fully grasped where all of this was headed. And this is where one of the most debated theories about him comes in, present for centuries in theological discussion. Was Judas hoping that Jesus, once captured, would finally reveal his full power, break free by force, and prove once and for all that he was the political messiah the people were waiting for, a real liberator, not a lamb who lets himself be led away without resistance? If that reading is correct, Judas didn't betray out of hatred. He betrayed while trying to force God's hand, pushing Jesus into the role Judas himself believed Jesus should take on. And when he realized the plan had gone terribly wrong, the weight of it crushed him completely. It's worth the disclaimer, this is a theological reading, not an explicit confirmation from the biblical text. What the Bible hands us are the pieces: greed, spiritual influence, devastating remorse, and leaves us trying to assemble the picture ourselves. It's uncomfortable because we prefer simple villains, easy to package. Judas resists that. There's one more detail few people stop to notice. Jesus knew. He knew beforehand. Well before the Last Supper, in John 6:70-71, he had already told the disciples, "Did I not choose you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil." And even knowing, he kept walking alongside him, eating with him, washing his feet at the Last Supper. The same act of service offered to every other disciple, without exception, with no different treatment reserved for the traitor. He was treated, right up to the end, exactly like any one of the 12. Does that change anything about how we see this story? I think it changes everything. Because if we reconstruct the entire Bible from Judas's perspective, from the calling by the lake, through years of miracles witnessed up close, to being trusted with the group's money, to the small wrong choices that may have been bigger than he ever realized. What's left isn't just the story of a generic traitor. It's the story of a man who had the same access, the same invitation, the same miracles in front of his eyes that Peter and John had, and who still chose, step by step, decision by decision, a different path. And what happened after the betrayal itself may be just as significant as the betrayal. While Judas walked away from the group, negotiating the price at the temple, the rest of the biblical story kept moving forward. A course that, ironically, depended exactly on what he was about to do. Without Judas's handover, there would be no arrest. Without arrest, no trial. Without trial, no crucifixion. And without crucifixion, according to the very logic at the center of the entire Christian narrative, there would be no redemption for anyone. Judas, without knowing it, had become the piece that unlocked the rest of the board, the man whose worst decision became, against his own will, part of the mechanism that Christian tradition describes as the greatest act of love ever recorded in human history. That doesn't excuse what he did. Jesus himself calls this moment something terrible. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Matthew 26:24. One of the harshest lines he speaks in all the Gospels. But it complicates any simple reading of the story. Judas isn't just the outsider villain, the stranger who never really belonged. He's the man from the inside, the one who had every reason to stay and still chose to leave. And maybe that's exactly what unsettles us so much when we look closely at this story. It's not about an isolated monster, distant from our own reality, easy to point a finger at. It's about someone who had the same access to the sacred that any faithful disciple had, and who still, decision after decision, drifted away. It's about the question that runs through anyone who has ever had real faith. Am I also, with all the access, with all the closeness I've ever had, capable of betraying what matters most for something small, for my own figurative 30 pieces of silver, scattered throughout my own life? In the end, Judas's story doesn't close with an easy answer. It ends with a man alone, returning money nobody wants anymore, unable to undo what was already done, while the rest of the story moved on without him. A course that, in a strange and uncomfortable way, he himself had helped set in motion. So here's the question for you. Do you think Judas was, deep down, evil from the start, or a man who slowly lost his way, decision by decision, until he could no longer turn back? Comment below with your opinion. I genuinely want to know what you all think, and I'll see you in the next video.